And we are live. What is up, everybody? This is Nick from P2W Fantasy, live here on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. So mixing things up today on Thursday, I do not have the regular guest, Steffi. I actually have another great guest on the show. Somehow convinced him to come on. I'm very appreciative of that. I have Eric Moody. So, Moody, appreciate you being on the show tonight.
No, I appreciate the invite. So very excited. It's always fun to have a game of true false and to talk fantasy football. So hey, if you need me, I'm here.
I really appreciate that. It wasn't tons and tons of notice, but shout out the DM, and again, very appreciative of you being here. So a little bit about Moody, some spark notes about him, and I'm going to let this guy plug himself because he's very busy and very active in the fantasy community and the fantasy world, but a member of the FSWA in the past. So you've been featured on 4for4, Fantasy Data, Dynasty League Football, RotoViz, Fantasy Pros, Gridiron Experts, 2QBs, The Athletic, and now most recently, the senior analyst at Pro Football Network. So if you actually Google or want to check out some of Eric Moody's work, you can look up his name and go to the Pro Football Network website. He's got some recent pieces that he's been active already with. He has Moody's Mailbag. You had the top NFL rookies to target for redraft, run and pass heavy offenses with fantasy value. So he's hitting a bunch of different topics, and he's not just briefly touching them. He's writing some great articles on them. So Moody, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, where to find you, and what you've been working on and everything you do?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for that brief plug. And so as Nick mentioned, senior fantasy analyst over at Pro Football Network. So essentially, my role there, I create written, audio, and video fantasy football content. Just for those that if you aren't familiar with Pro Football Network, we're the primary voice for pro football. So we create a lot of content on the site. All the latest NFL news and rumors, analysis regarding like fantasy football, betting, the NFL draft, college football, and more. But I know Nick mentioned a lot of my recent work that's over there. Another piece I would like to plug, which I thought was really one of my most recent favorite ones, would be it's an article around Chase Edmonds. I know we have a NFL insider that recently joined Pro Football Network, Adam Beasley. And so he broke some news around Chase Edmonds, being the RB1 and getting the majority of the opportunity share in that backfield from James Conner in Arizona. So I wrote a fantasy piece kind of surrounding, that news, and I built some of my updated projections into that. And so that was really a nice collaboration between, Adam and myself. So I look forward to doing more pieces like that here in the near future. But you can find all my content there and reach out on Twitter. Always happy to help.
I like the fact that you're receiving some recent news and you're taking it and breaking it down, because we see so much camp talk during this time of year and so much of the coaches talking about things. And it's easy to talk about, Dalvin Cook and Christian McCaffrey, but it's not so easy to talk about some backfields that we have tons of questions about, Arizona Cardinals being one of them. So I do respect that a lot, jumping on some news and putting your own spin on your thoughts on that. So that is awesome and something to definitely look out for. As we get into the show, I have to always plug this podcast is partnered up with Fantasy Points Media Group. So that is my one-stop shop for everything fantasy as a content creator. If you're looking for redraft, dynasty, DFS, best ball, all in one spot. So check out fantasypoints.com/subscribe, promo code 21WIN10. So as Moody briefly mentioned before, we're talking some true or false, some fantasy true or false. I think this time of year, we're slowly getting into actual camp, but there's tons of questions and statements that come out for fantasy football. So I have a great mind on the show, so I'm definitely going to pick a great mind and ask Moody some true or false fantasy questions here. Thank you guys for tuning in. Looks like we have some good live viewers, and we will get to that in a second here.
Play to win, no fear to give. I feel but I can't forgive. I go all in this time, yeah, I won't regret. I'll pick the best on trip, they don't understand. I play to win, yeah, I play to win, I play to win. Yeah, I play to win, I play to win. Oh, play to win, I play to win. Yeah, play to win, I play to win.
So as mentioned before, the intro video there, we're going to talk some fantasy true or false, but I have to touch on one of the most recent news. I feel like today the sleeper app has been going off here and there for different bits of news, but the biggest piece of news this week, Moody, is Cam Akers. I'm sure you've talked about it before, but I want to make sure we touch base on it on the podcast here. So for those of you who may have missed it, Cam Akers is set to miss the entire 2021 season with a torn Achilles. It's a tough injury, massive blow for a running back that a lot of people were expecting to break out this year. We look at the team that they have right now. Daryl Henderson, he had some chances this past season before eventually losing the job to Cam, but he had some decent fantasy weeks, 20.1, 19 points, 21.8 points, 15.4 points. That's PPR. He had some decent weeks this past year, and his stock seems to have skyrocketed. They've had some special team players being mentioned. Xavier Jones is a big name. They have Raymond Calais. They also have 7th-round rookie Jake Funk. So there's big questions. Who's going to be the guy? There's other people that chime in and say, hey, there's some other good guys floating out there. You know, Todd Gurley before the bye this past year, weeks 1 through 9, was the RB6. I've heard a lot of that. I've heard Adrian Peterson, Le'Veon Bell, Duke Johnson, a bunch of names. People are saying, trade for James Robinson, trade for Melvin Gordon. There's so much talk right now, and Moody, having you on the show, I have to pick your mind. What do you think is going to be the eventual move for the Rams? It's tough to tell, but what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I would say my opinion, it's not going to be like a high-profile move. To your point, I'm like Daryl Henderson performed very, very well, and given an opportunity last year, especially early in the year. And so I think we see a scenario, the Rams going to training camp. They got Daryl Henderson, they got Xavier Jones, Jake Funk. And, with the comments, they may be acting stoic, publicly stating that, hey, we don't have any plans to sign a free agent running back. My personal opinion, I'd love to see them target someone like Duke Johnson. If you look at Duke Johnson's career, I'm like, he hasn't gotten a substantial opportunity share, but he has been productive, in 91 active games. And he's only averaged, 9.5 opportunities, 52 total yards and 10 PPR fantasy points per game. And so I think he can be a valuable contributor, to the Rams backfield. I'm like, you can line him up all over the field as a receiver. He can impact the game as a runner, receiver out of the backfield. So that's a move that I'd like to see them make, because to be candid, I'm really surprised that Duke Johnson is still out there.
Yeah, he's been floating out in free agency, and it's been interesting. I think he's a guy for dynasty leagues. A lot of people have still kind of held on to, because they can see him coming into for fantasy purposes being this good pass catching back out of the backfield. And I think what you bring a good point to is they might be looking to Henderson is a guy that's going to get a lot of touches, and how do we complement him in the backfield? And if you bring in a guy that has the same sort of profile is Henderson, I mean, what are we going to get from that? I think a lot of these backfields we've seen eventually for the 1-2 punches, two guys that are different. A lot of people, we talked about it, Steffi and I, on the show before, it was interesting seeing the Raiders bring in Kenyon Drake, because it seems like him and Josh Jacobs aren't these massively different profile players. So I think Duke Johnson is a good person to think about there. Would you say, let's say deeper dynasty leagues? I'm just throwing curveballs at you here.
No, that's fine.
Would you try to check out that waiver wire, or check out some of these low price guys now in order to maybe capitalize later down the road, or do you just kind of got to play it by ear for this?
Yeah, I don't think it's any harm in kind of speculating a little bit, depending if you have the roster spot available. So just stashing someone like Duke Johnson or any other kind of under the radar running back that's on your waiver wire, it's never a bad move. You can always just drop them later.
Yeah, absolutely. And all the people that have been throwing the names for a trade, it would be interesting to see how that would work out, because it seems like the Rams are usually off-hauling their picks in advance because they're in this win now mode. So definitely a devastating injury. Always want to look out for the guy that got hurt, and prayers up for Cam Akers. Hopefully he returns back. A lot of people have been trying to compare this situation to other running backs that has happened, but the sample size isn't as massive. So my one last bit of advice is I probably wouldn't sell him for a 4th round in Dynasty. I think I'd just kind of sit tight and just pivot in fantasy. But that's just kind of what I'm getting after. So obviously want to talk about that, but let's get into the bulk of the show. So fantasy true or false. So I'm going to ask Moody some questions here, and these are a bunch of random questions, but I think what we get at after answering these questions might be valuable pieces of information for 2021 and forward here. So I have a bunch of different positional things, team things, and what I'm going to ask Moody is, do you think the statement I'm asking or the question I'm asking is more true or more false, and then why? So let's get right into that. First, we'll talk about the Baltimore Ravens here. So Mark Andrews, tight end 6 in 2020. The Ravens added Rashad Bateman from Minnesota in round 1, Teelan Wallace from Oklahoma State in round 4. On a side note, Sammy Watkins is now a Raven as well. So first question, Moody, true or false? The additions of Rashad Bateman and Teelan Wallace hurts Andrews' fantasy value. What do we think of that?
Yeah, my answer on this one is false, and I'll tell you why. Like, you look at Mark Andrews, he's accumulated 186 targets over the last 2 seasons. Based on my projections, and when you look at Andrews, I can see him getting around like 105 targets, 65 receptions, 850 receiving yards, and like 8 touchdowns. And like, again, he has the potential to finish as a top 5 fantasy tight end, PPR formats. So you look at Bateman. I think Bateman, has like a legitimate chance to finish, is really the most targeted Ravens wide receiver. Like, if you look at Marquise Brown and Bateman, I have both of them combined for around 185 targets. I do think it's in the realm of possibility that Bateman does out-target Marquise Brown. It just depends on how quickly he gets calibrated with Lamar Jackson. Like, you look at Bateman's like final season or college season, I would say, it was derailed, by COVID-19. But his 2019 season was like exquisite, for those that, may have forgotten. I'm like, a little bit over 1,200 receiving yards, 11 touchdowns. The guy's phenomenal, like at yards after the catch, tackle breaking abilities there. He's great. When you look at Lamar Jackson, I have him projected for around 460 pass attempts. So I think it's possible that you have, I think definitely 2 Ravens pass catchers that have over 100 targets, but it's in the realm of possibility that we have 3. And I think it'll be Andrews, possibly Brown, and Bateman.
I like a lot of the points too, because again, we're talking about Andrews here, but now we start throwing in names of guys like Rashad Bateman, who I think kind of slipped off the radar for some people, because I think the generic like stance on the Ravens is this is a run heavy offense that doesn't really focus on the pass, even though for a lot of people, Bateman was their wide receiver 2 or 3, some people number 1 out of this draft class. And I think he's on a good offense. And I think this offense, we know they're going to run the ball a ton. But running the ball a ton is going to put them in some good field positions. I think for Andrews, having the focus in the past of Marquise Brown and Willie Snead, I think that's different for a defense prepping to play them than having Rashad Bateman, and now you have Marquise and you have Wallace as well. So I think there might even be, I know it's generic to say this too, there might be the possibility of more freedom on the field for Mark Andrews in comparison to the past where who are they really throwing the ball to? I think this season is going to be huge for Lamar Jackson to have more options, but I think Bateman's a guy that kind of fell off the radar that can have sneaky value, because like Moody said, and I'm in agreement with it, he might just be the most targeted guy on the Ravens for that wide receiver core. So I do think Mark Andrews is set to have the same sort of year, if not have a little bit more freedom around the field. Do you think Lamar Jackson, this is a side, I'm going to have a couple side questions here. Do you think Lamar Jackson's, do you think he's going to have an elevated fantasy season in comparison to last year due to the additions, or do you think the whole scheme is going to be somewhat the same as they've been operating?
Yeah, I think it'll be eerily similar to how it was last year. I know he started off slow, but if you look at like especially the second half of the season, he finished very, very strong. So I do believe that we'll see even more of a progression from Lamar Jackson. But to kind of echo your points a little bit too, Nick, is that they've got him surrounded by like his best supporting cast that he's had in his career. That he has to leverage those weapons. So I'm looking forward to seeing what happens.
And for Andrews, do you have him kind of projected around the same area as we've been projecting him then? I don't know if you have came out with your own rankings yet or anything like that, but is he kind of safely within that top 5 or 6 for you, do you think, for this season?
Yeah, no, absolutely. He's definitely in the top 6. So he'll have to have some things kind of go his way for him to finish like in the top three. Yep. But I think anywhere from 3 to 6 is very, very reasonable.
Absolutely. I'm in total agreement with that. So, and that's my whole thinking making this question is we start thinking kind of too far ahead of sometimes, because you add some pieces to a team and you think that people that have been good might not be as important, but he can be the same sort of value with the same sort of ceiling, I think. So let's move over to Denver. Denver's had a lot of questions this offseason. I mean, we can talk about the wide receiver core, what that's going to look like, who's more important, who's going to be playing quarterback. We can go to the running back position and say who's going to win this job and keep this job. Denver is very interesting. The one thing I'm super happy with as far as the Denver Broncos is that they let the guy behind me slip to my Chicago Bears, Justin Fields. So I'm a side Denver fan, I think, for that. But in all seriousness, Cortland Sutton was the wide receiver 19 in 2019 before an injury-plagued 2020. So he was out pretty much the entire season this past year. First-round pick Jerry Jeudy had 113 targets his rookie year. We now have this dilemma also on the Broncos with Drew Lock versus Teddy Bridgewater, who is now on the team. Who's going to win that job? And a lot of people have said statements regarding the wide receivers. Hey, if this guy is the starting quarterback, this wide receiver will be the wide receiver 1. Some people have said, I don't care who the quarterback is, this guy is the wide receiver 1. So because of these multiple questions I've seen, at least, my question to you, true or false, who finishes higher in fantasy for the wide receiver position between Cortland Sutton and Jerry Jeudy is dependent on if the QB is Lock or Bridgewater? True or false?
Yeah, for that one, I'm going with false on this one as well, because if you look at like wide receiver stats and like the ones that are really predictive, the ones that are really sticky, obviously targets, air yards, looking at it on a per game basis. But if you look at Cortland Sutton, Jerry Jeudy, I'm like, both are projected, for at least 120 or more targets. So I think both of them are going to have an eerily similar target share. It's kind of more of like a 1A and a 1B. But the quarterback competition between like Bridgewater and Lock, I'm like, it's ultimately going to benefit the offense. And this is why. You look at Bridgewater. I'm like, he's got a career completion percentage of 66.5%. And he's averaged in his career 7.3 yards per attempt, an average. You look at Lock, it's a little bit more hideous, 59% completion percentage.
Yep.
6.6, yards, per attempt per average. So I'm like, if you look at it, it's easy to say, okay, hey, Bridgewater is going to be the superior option. But again, I think the bottom line is that whoever wins the job is going to benefit the Broncos. When you look at the quarterback position, I know it's insane, but it is possible, that Drew Lock maximized like his offseason, and he's actually improving as an NFL quarterback going into this season. So if you look at Jeudy and Sutton, I think both of them can exceed 1,000 receiving yards in 2021. I think both are really nice values in drafts right now.
The interest, and kind of like what you just ended with Drew Lock. I think I mentioned this on a podcast before, but I played college soccer back in Illinois, and every year we'd have some transfer students come in, and these guys are transferring in with the intent to come and take people's jobs. So I think that sometimes back in the day when we had some starters from the previous year, seeing guys from the same position coming in, it was this massive like breathing on your neck saying, hey, either you improve and you do things better this season, or the guy behind you is taking that job. And maybe for Drew Lock, it's been a big push for him in the offseason to say, hey, you might have the keys right now, but if you drop the keys, this other guy's going to pick up and, drive the car here. So it'll be interesting. My opinion, I'm curious to hear yours. I think that they might let Drew Lock prove himself and have the role early on. And then it might be a short leash versus the other way around where you give the new guy the job and maybe it doesn't work out. So you go back to your younger, who was supposed to be franchise quarterback. I think that's a weird way to go about it. I think they might give Drew Lock the job and say, hey, if you don't perform, it's going to be Teddy's job. Do you think, what's your thoughts on that? How that might roll out? It's kind of unpredictable right now and it's back and forth, but what's your thoughts with that?
Yeah, it's one of those scenarios, at least when I look at projections like right now, I have them both projected to make starts. It is not a clean situation. To your point, it's not clean at all. But I'm like, again, if we're looking just at Judy and Sutton, I'm like, they're still going to get the targets. It could be from Bridgewater, it could be from Block, but they're still going to get fed.
Yeah, and when it comes to those two guys, I was in a conversation earlier. I'm a big Jerry Jeudy truther. I think that personally, he's my wide receiver one out of this past draft class. I think the talent's there. I think he had a lot against him. I think he's got to clean some things up in his game, obviously, from this previous season. But it was interesting to think about the push and give between the two quarterbacks. But I think at the end of the day, I'm with you in saying both guys for fantasy, both of these wide receivers can have a nice season because either Drew Lock is going to be competent or Teddy Bridgewater will be, or it's going to be one or the other. And I think whoever does start, if they're not, things will be fixed. And it's way better than the situation that was there last season. That's for sure. Do you have a big gap between Sutton and Jeudy, or do you think they're going to finish kind of neck and neck for fantasy?
Yeah, I think they. Yeah, I was looking at the Broncos stuff earlier today.
It's kind of tough.
Yeah, like I could see just based on my memory, thinking of the spreadsheet for where Sutton may have like anywhere from like 100 to 300 additional yards than Jeudy. But I think Judy's in a good spot to get 1,000 receiving yards. It may be a scenario where Sutton may be at like 1,200, but then Jeudy may end up being like at 950 or 1,000. But it's going to be close, and I think both are really good values. It's one of those scenarios if you're in a draft where you're like, okay, who should I pick? I would just go with whoever remains, because you may end up getting like a value. One of them could end up going like a round or two later than if you drafted them at their ADP. So that's the way that I would approach it, just in a draft.
And we've seen, for fantasy purposes, we've seen some decent games out of Lock with Sutton before, so we know that that is a capability. We also saw Teddy Bridgewater this past season support 3 top 25 wide receivers, even though he's not the most sexy fantasy quarterback. So there is definitely opportunity for both of these guys there.
Yeah, totally.
We'll move on here to the running back position. And again, Moody, for these shows on Thursdays, we talk about a variety of things, kind of bounce around sometimes. I think there are shows where I kind of transition nicely into things, but I think from a listener's perspective, it's kind of nice to hear just all different things that they might be thinking, different positions, different teams. So I'm bouncing around here, but I think everything's kind of flowing good at the end. So we'll get into the next guy here. Jonathan Taylor, this is interesting. Weeks 1 through 17, Jonathan Taylor finishes the RB6. Weeks 13 through 17 this past season, he was on an absolute tear. He was the RB1. So talk about a guy who had another guy in his system with Hines who had some great games, took some passing work away, but Jonathan Taylor still went on a tear and was very good year one for fantasy. So that draws the question. There's a lot of dynasty people, including myself. I love playing dynasty that starts to think ahead. Who's going to eventually be that McCaffrey, or who's eventually going to be that RB1. So my true or false to you, Moody, is if Jonathan Taylor finishes the season again as a top 10 running back, he should be in consideration for the dynasty overall RB1. Is that true or false to you?
I would say on this one, it is true.
Oh, all right.
You brought up a lot of good points, and I'll back it up. The Colts, they gradually worked Taylor into the rotation last season, but he went like final boss form, like fully unleashed, like from week 11 to 17. I'm like, if you look at some of the, I'm like, he just went boom. But he played 61% of the offensive snaps, averaged around like 23 opportunities per game, 139.5 total yards, 24.3 PPR fantasy points, 5 RB1 finishes out of those 6 games. So phenomenal. I know some draft analysts going into, the draft, I think we're concerned about like his limited reception totals and drops, coming out of Wisconsin. But I think the guy's very capable as a receiver out of the backfield. I'm like, he ended the season with 4 consecutive games of 4 or more targets. Like he averaged like the 9th most fantasy points per target, just ahead of Vikings running back Dalvin Cook. He finished as I think a top 6 PPR back. I think RB6, if my memory serves me right. 253 PPR fantasy points as a 21-year-old rookie. Like if you look at like history, I'm like, it bodes well. I'm like, this is a guy, he's really just scratching the surface of what he's capable of as a pro. I'm like, the only running backs who have scored like 250 or more PPR fantasy points during the age 21 seasons, like over the last 10 years, were Saquon Barkley and Ezekiel Elliott. And so with that type of company, going into, his second season, solid Colts scheme, solid offensive line, I'm like, again, he's just scratching the surface of what he's capable of. So from a dynasty lens, I think that bodes pretty well for his outlook.
I completely agree, and I love the fact that you brought up the pass catching, because I think that when people try to project the dynasty RB1, we've seen a couple different guys float around there at some point. We saw Christian McCaffrey probably spend the most time as the dynasty RB1, but people had Saquon there as well. Back in the day, it might have been Zeke. Dalvin Cook floats around there, and what do those guys all have in common? They catch the ball. And I know Hines is there, and he's a massive pass catcher, but like you said, Moody, this guy had some decent targeted games. You go down the list, he had games where he had 6, 4, 4, and 4 receptions on some decent targets, and he caught the ball, off my memory, I'm pretty sure at an 88% catch rate or something like that. So he was very efficient in the passing game. And then you look at the last few weeks from 13 to 17, like I mentioned and you mentioned before, scoring 22.5, 30.5. He had a 38.4 fantasy week in the last week of the season with 253 rushing yards. So for a guy that can do it all, if he comes in year 2 as a dynasty ranker, let's say you are, or if you're trying to make some targets for a big trade, this guy might just be he might just be the overall RB1. I think this year is going to be very telling, because obviously we know that they have a new quarterback at hand, and this guy's in year 2 and he's very young. So I can see it happening. I can see it happening. I think with Taylor, are you concerned at all this year if Hines digs too much into his role, or do you think, based off of seeing enough passing work, that it'll be kind of consistent with that this year again?
Yeah, I think it'll be consistent. I believe what we saw later in the season will be kind of what all of 2021 will look like, for Taylor. And I know he's aware of what his opportunities are. I know he's been, according to reports, working on his pass catching skills this offseason. So I think we'll see the more progression, that's there. It's just like if you're an employee at a company, you have your year-end review. When you talk about your strengths and what your opportunities are, you're going to develop a coaching action plan to address, those opportunities. Same thing in the NFL. These are professionals. This is their career. Their day-to-day job, and they know what they need to work on. And he's the type of guy that he will put the work in to improve. So I can't wait to see it.
And you love to see that, because we've seen enough in some other sports where. And I won't say any names. I'm rocking the Bucks jersey right now. I've been a Bucks fan in Chicago since 2021. In all seriousness, though, but we've seen guys in the NBA, guys from Philly, for instance, who can't really shoot free throws, right? And never really worked to get better at it, it seems like. But you got a guy in Jonathan Taylor at a high level who wants to get after maybe an aspect of his game that he needs to improve upon. So I love that point. I also I actually like having some other guys in the system that can kind of complement him, because we see often some guys get run into the ground, and that was a major concern for Taylor coming into the NFL. Is this guy's been used and abused at Wisconsin, and he's going to come into the NFL and have all this wear and tear. So having a guy like Hines who can just come in, relieve Jonathan Taylor for some reps, get in some passing work, and switch up the game, I think is actually a benefit. Whereas, some fantasy people will say, oh, man, I just want him to be the Christian McCaffrey and just do every single thing in his offense. So a lot of interesting things to think about versus what was said before.
Yeah.
All right. So I got another running back. We'll go right into a running back. This is where we're flowing into the topic actually correctly here. But the Patriots have been an interesting team to talk about in the offseason here. So 2019 third-round pick, Damian Harris, has some camp talk that he might be the number one guy. There's some good camp talk about him. 5.0 yards per carry on 691 rushing yards in 2020. Got some opportunities then. Cam Newton, though, looks like he's holding this role. He's got Mac Jones. We said it before, the analogy kind of breathing on his neck, wanting to play football, but it looks like Cam Newton's holding this role. So my question to you, Moody, true or false? Damian Harris's value will be dependent on if Cam Newton or Mac Jones is the quarterback for more games this season. Is that true or false?
Yeah, for this one, it is false. I'm going with false on this one. So you look at New England. They have consistently had a very robust running game for years, and they've had outstanding offensive line play, just consistently year in and year out for well over like a decade. And so Damian Harris, he can thrive whether Newton's under center, or Mac Jones. So you look at Damian Harris like last year, he got off to like a really slow start. I know he kind of dealt with that ankle injury, but once he got going, he was really going because he, the 10 games that he played, he averaged nearly 14 rushing attempts and 69 rushing yards per game, averaged 5 yards per rushing attempt last year, while facing stacked boxes on a little bit over 42% of his rushing attempts. So phenomenal in between the tackles and can really create yards, especially after contact, all those things you want in a running back. So the Patriots, I know they didn't pick up running back Sony Michel's fifth-year option. And at least in my opinion, he's a candidate to be cut, during the preseason, which could open up the door even more for Damian Harris. And so you're looking at Harris this year. He could easily be provided like 240 or more rushing attempts like in 2021. He's a really nice value at his ADP right now, in my opinion. Yeah,
and I think news broke today. Ramondre Stevenson, I think, is on the injured list as well. Not that he was going to come and definitely steal the job or something like that, but the backfield is getting a little bit thinner. I had Scott Barrett on the show a couple weeks ago from Fantasy Points, and he wrote an article talking about the Konami code for quarterbacks and some myths, and I feel like there's always this big stamp on, hey, if the quarterback runs, the running back's not going to be too good. And, Cam Newton, if he's a quarterback, he's going to steal all the goal line work because he scored 12 touchdowns this past season. But on the same note, and I've said this before, and maybe I'm off, but I think that this year, the Patriots with Bill Belichick, I think they brought in 2 tight ends for a good reason. They brought in some other guys, Nelson Aguilar and some other Kendrick Bourne. But I think they're going to be very methodical about the way that they manage the game and the way that they move up the field. And I think moving up the field might be heavy usage for the tight ends. It might be heavy usage, hard words, on the run. So I think if that's the system they play versus like this high-flying offense, like fast-paced like the Cardinals, it's not going to be like that. I think it's going to be very methodical, get up the field, do things the right way, be smart about the way they play. And I think teams that play that way, the run game's important. So if that's the way that they play, even if it's Mac Jones or even if it's Cam Newton, I think Harris might have some good value, and he's going very low. I don't know the ADP off the top of my head, but you said he could be a very good value right now. So is he a guy that you would say, hey, target later in the drafts because he can step up this year and be a good flex or an RB fantasy asset?
Yeah, I look at Harris and he's a solid RB3, with upside or an upside flex. It's just I feel like over the last month, his ADP has been kind of rising a little bit. If my memory serves me right, I think it's now in the 5th or 6th round, in 12-team PPR. So I think with some of the news flow, it's impacting his ADP, but I still like him in that range. And then if you're someone that's implementing a zero running back strategy, and if you're looking for a running back in the 5th or 6th round, he's not a bad target. As your first running back off the board. It's definitely some upside, that's there in my opinion. But yeah.
And I think if that is your strategy, once you get to the later rounds, I think you have to kind of look and identify, hey, I'm weighing these 2 guys out. Who can get some nice volume? I think volume is everything for the running back position. So if a guy like Harris can get nice volume, then it could be a good value because it's not always the easiest thing to get as a running back. All right. So next one on the list here, we see stacks all the time for fantasy. It seems like it's a big draft season, whether it's best ball or dynasty startups. Redraft season is right around the corner, and some people talk about, hey, if you're going to stack, do it this way or don't stack. And when we talk about stack, for those that maybe are not familiar with what that actually means, it's when you're just grabbing 2 players from the same team. A lot of times people will look at stacking a quarterback with a wide receiver or a tight end on the same team because of the opportunity for good fantasy points. And one stack that comes to mind for a lot of people is the Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce stack for fantasy. There's a lot of stacks you can have, though, for fantasy across all the teams. My question to you, Moody, If you're stacking, is the Mahomes-Kelsey stack the best possible stack for 2021? Is that true or false?
I'd say it's true. I'm going to go with true on this one because I'm like, you look at Mahomes, I'm like, he's finished as a QB1 in 71% of his games over the last 3 seasons. He's averaged 27 fantasy points per game. You look at Kelsey, he's been phenomenal. I'm like 18.5 PPR fantasy points per game over that same time frame. Like, this is a guy that's finished as a tight end 1 in 87% of his games, like in PPR. I'm like, if you do stack them like this season, I'm like, if you look at kind of looking at my projections, I'm like, they could easily combine for like 45 to 50 PPR points per game, like in 2021. I'm like, who wouldn't want that, right?
Yeah, I can't argue with you. I think, you know, I've seen this question multiple times, just scanning Twitter, you know, what's the best stack? And a lot of people like to argue, well, it comes down to ADP or comes down to what's the actual ceiling for players. And I've seen some stacks such as Josh Allen and Stephon Diggs, or Kyler Murray and DeAndre Hopkins, or Justin Herbert and Keenan Allen, or Russell Wilson and DK Metcalf. But I think when it comes to that, I think all of those stacks can be good. I think they all can be good. But I think when it comes to fantasy, you have to sometimes look at, how do I get the best advantage in my league? And for all of those situations, if all of your league mates have those stacks we just mentioned, you can have the Mahomes and Kelsey stack and have the tight end quarterback advantage, and then just compete at the wide receiver position because it's so deep. There's so many guys that can finish as a top 5 wide receiver this year. Yeah. Is there so many guys that can finish as the tight end 1? Probably not, right? We probably see maybe 3 guys, maybe, with the tier being 1 or 2, you know? So I think you have to look at, how do I get the best advantage in my fantasy league? I'm not sure if that's the way you've looked at things before, or if you agree with that.
Yeah, because I'm like, if you got Mahomes, I'm like, you're not having to worry about who am I going to stream this week, or if you take a late round quarterback on, you know, who am I going to pair, you know, with that quarterback? And the late round quarterback strategy is great. I'm like, JJ Zacharyson has done a phenomenal job with introducing that strategy or that concept to the industry.
Yep.
But I'm like, that was many years ago. If you look at things now, it's like, if everyone is conditioned to go with that strategy, I think that's where the opportunity is at, in that chaos, you know, kind of referencing Sun Tzu there, for where you're like, okay, I may be able to get Mahomes in the 3rd or maybe 4th round, depending on my league mates. I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then with Kelsey, I mean, if you have an elite tight end, you don't have to worry about which tight end am I going to stream this week. You could probably get by most of the season just rostering like 1 tight end. And so you lock up those 2 spots. Everyone has to adapt their strategy slightly if they're using tiers or just going down rankings. You know, you have to know your league. But I'm like, if you lock in those 2 positions, there's going to be some value, you know, that presents itself. And then I just think we got to get out of this mindset of being so, I guess the right word is like conditioned, like with these different draft strategies, like, oh, I must use, values-based drafting, or I've got to do zero RB. You know, I got to do it. Best feedback that I can give everyone is just, you know, do your research ahead of time. Have your sleepers list, you know, but use your positional tiers, because it's so less stressful, because you just adapt to what your league makes you doing, and the value will be there. Believe me, it will. Just trust your research.
And to add, because that is a great point. That's a great point. And to add to that, I think that I tweeted something out before. Everybody, I think, likes to have a strategy or a mindset going into their draft, or have a list of guys. But we do see so many people that say before a draft, like, I want to go into this draft with this specific strategy. In this round, I'm going to do this. You know, at this pick, I'm going to do this. But everything seems nice and black and white until you get into a draft and you realize it's not robotic. You saw, if you participated in the Scott Fish Bowl, for anybody listening, it was not predictable with the way that people drafted. You had all different sorts of people drafting. If you do a startup, I did a startup this past weekend. Guys that we thought were going to go in the 5th went in the 2nd. Like, weird stuff happens. So I think, like you are alluding to, like, go in with some ideas about, hey, I'm looking to draft these couple guys in this round, or I really like these few guys I'm going to target then. But I think going in with this specific 0 RB, or stack the RBs, and, you know, not pivot off the draft. You have to kind of pivot off the way that the board is flowing sometimes, because it's not predictable. It's not robotic, you know?
Yeah.
Absolutely. I love that point. I love that point. I'm gonna have to clip that for sure, because I think it's good for fantasy, because everybody talks about strategy, but strategy is one thing until it's a live draft and it's not going the way you thought it is, So that's the fun of drafting.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
All right. So talking about elite players, elite running backs. One thing we see out of some of the top level guys is pass catching, right? Mm-hmm. I pulled some data, and I think it was from 2016 to 2020, something along those lines. And like 2/3 out of guys that caught 60 or more passes were top 12 running backs, something along those lines. I think it was 2/3 of guys that had like 60 or more receptions. So pass catching running backs are very, very good for fantasy. It's something I personally target all the time for PPR purposes. So it's interesting to look forward here for the top level pass catching backs. And one guy comes to mind. He's in a little bit different of a situation than he's been in before, because the quarterback position is up for grabs depending on the way you look at it. But Alvin Kamara finally beat his 3-year streak of catching 81 receptions in 2020. He went 3 years of catching 81 balls, and in 2020 he caught 83. So he beat that. So my question to you, Alvin Kamara, we know him as a pass catcher. True or false? He will lead the running backs this year in running back receptions. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm going with true on this one. You look at Sean Payton. He's been like a staple, in New Orleans, since 2006. And he's always historically leaned heavily like on his running backs. And I know people are up in arms over, what if it's Jameis Winston? What if it's Taysom Hill? Oh no, it's like the sky is falling. It's like the way I look at it is like it's Payton's scheme. I'm like, it's his scheme. I'm like, he was the architect of this scheme. And Drew Brees obviously helped, but he executed it to perfection. And I think a lot of people forget that. And so I still believe that the running backs will be heavily targeted. If you look since 2006, running backs in Peyton's scheme have averaged, 10.6 targets, 8 receptions, and 62 receiving yards per game. On my projections, Kamara projects for 100 plus targets and 75 plus receptions in 2021. And that's, whether Winston is in there under center or Hill. So
it's interesting. I like the point of like not thinking super heavy on the quarterback situation and thinking more about the team situation and the scheme of the way that the Saints have operated. It's the same coach. I think that Kamara is going to be obviously one of the biggest playmakers. We don't look at anybody else outside of Michael Thomas as the clear-cut guy. A lot of people want to talk about Adam Troutman as a potential guy to step up. But if you look at the rest of the wide receivers, Traquan Smith, you go down the list, like Callaway, we're not entirely sure who that guy's going to be, but we do know that Kamara is going to be given the football, whether he lines up from the backfield or maybe he's in a slot. I mean, the guy can line up in different areas and be effective. A couple guys, obviously, we want to think about Christian McCaffrey being back as well, but then there's that kind of iffiness of, hey, is he going to be overutilized coming off of those injuries? Not entirely sure. I think he's still going to be one of the best, if not the best running backs in the league. I always think about Austin Eckler because of looking at what him and Justin Herbert did together. I talked about it before. The amount of targets he was getting, I think he had 16 in one game with Justin Herbert. That system also utilizes him a lot, but that system's changing. So that's one comparison to maybe think about from, my own perspective. When I thought about it, I thought Austin Eckler, but I didn't think about what you just brought up. Hey, the coaching staff, are they the same or different? Alvin Kamara, same team, same coaching staff from the head coaching point of view. Austin Eckler, it's changing a bit. Not saying that he won't pass catch a bunch, but we do know these guys are going to be elite at that, and it'll be interesting. I wonder if he will regress and just start going back to that 81 catch rate again, and go back to what the norm was for him. That'll be interesting. So another team we talked about before, we talked about the Colts changing. We just mentioned the quarterbacks for the Saints being kind of a big question mark and how that's going to operate. Well, the Colts, I think, are a continued question mark for not Jonathan Taylor, who we talked about before, but the quarterback and the wide receivers. So Carson Wentz, Philadelphia Eagle, turns into a Indianapolis Colt. New QB, this draws the question of who will be the target leader. So the target leader for the Colts this year. Last year, the order for the top 4 targeted players for the Colts was T.Y. Hilton, Nyheim Hines, Zach Pascal, and then Michael Pittman Jr. I want to ask about this guy, though, because people want badly some of the rookies from the previous year to break out. I mentioned Jerry Jeudy. That's one of my guys. I want him badly to break out this year. Another guy that has been talked about a lot is Michael Pittman Jr. So true or false, Michael Pittman Jr. will be the leader in targets this year for the Colts. Do you think that's true or false? And if false, who do you think it is?
I'm gonna go with false. Hope isn't always a viable strategy. I know people want Pittman to kind of break out, but it'll be close. But I do see T.Y. Hilton, leading the Colts in targets, reception, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. I'm like, we just want to push this guy out to pasture. But I'm like, he's had 5 seasons on his NFL resume of 1,000 or more receiving yards. He's been a Pro Bowler 4 times. I'm like, you've got Carson Wentz that's coming in. He's reunited with Frank Reich. I think it's a great thing, not only for Wentz's career, but I think also for Hilton in 2021. So,
and if I were to look at ADP, I know he's going very, very low. But wide receiver 42 for PPR this past season. He had some big games where he was getting targeted a ton, 11 times, 7 times. The last 2 weeks of the season, 7 times. So I think sometimes when a new quarterback comes into a system, we think, hey, he's going to build a new connection with a new guy, and we're not sure who it is. But at the same time, knowing that you got that veteran on the field, he might be the easy target at times. Could Pittman be, a red zone threat and have some nice value there if he finds the red zone and, score some touchdowns? Sure. But at the same time, you got a guy that is capable and and sometimes we get kind of shied away from the older guys when it's clear because, like you said, we have this hope for guys we might have taken in our rookie draft. So I think the ADP says Pittman, but it'll be interesting to see who actually gets drafted a little bit higher, closer to camp when the camp talk comes out and says, hey, Carson Wentz has built a good connection with X wide receiver.
Yeah, very true. It's coming.
All right, I think we got 2 more here on the slot. Again, a lot of these questions have come from kind of dilemmas and back and forths I've seen on Twitter of people kind of arguing one stance or the other and trying to figure out, hey, how can I get a step ahead in this guy's ranking if X happens? And one situation is the Green Bay Packers. Don't like talking about them too much as a Bears fan, but it's necessary for fantasy purposes. But Aaron Jones, a guy I've liked for fantasy. He's been a top 5 running back the past 2 seasons. Fantasy Pros ADP that I checked earlier today has Jones as the RB10 currently. But we have this big back and forth with the quarterback. He's on golf carts. He's making jokes. We don't know what's going on with him. It might be Jordan Love. We don't know. So true or false, we should adjust Aaron Jones' ranking depending on if Aaron Rodgers plays for the Packers or not this year. Do you think that's true or false?
I think that's false. I'm chuckling over the Aaron Rodgers situation, all these cryptic messages, tweets.
So is he though.
I know, just photos while on vacation. I'm just like, come on. I'm like, let's be adults about this. But regardless of his situation, I'm like, I don't think Jones's numbers, will take a hit. I'm like, whether you've got Aaron Rodgers under center, or Jordan Love, or if there's another quarterback that they'll bring in. But one thing about Matt LaFleur's offense, I'm like, it does cater to players like Jones and his strengths. And I think in the conversations earlier this year when he decided to sign with the Packers long term, I'm sure some conversation around Aaron Rodgers' future, it had to have come into that conversation. And so, exactly. And so I just think it's a scenario where it's like, hey, we're still going to feed, Aaron Jones. I'm like, he averaged, 19 opportunities and 19 PPR fantasy points per game. I think over the last, my memory serves me right, I think 2 or 3 seasons. But I'm like, the point is, I'm like, that type of production still can continue in 2021 if we have Jordan Love that's under center. I like Jones right now because he's a really, really nice value. Just given the uncertainty around like Aaron Rodgers, a lot of people are fading him, and I think he's a great target. I'm like, especially if you're drafting like in the 11th or 12th spot in the 12 team format, like at the turn, like being able to get him in the early second round, like as your RB1, I think that's solid. So no, I like him a lot.
I think so too, and he's a guy that we've seen do it all. He's rushed well. He's found the end zone. He's had good reception stats. We've talked about pass catching running backs plenty on this show, but a guy who's had multiple 5-catch games for some decent yardage too. And I think you don't want to finesse your league, right? You don't want to play the news or anything like that. But people get uncomfortable sometimes when there's murky situations. You can't really read a situation, so you actually might be able to, if you are in like a dynasty, trade for Aaron Jones for a decent value. And I think it's a recommendation because he's done it the past 2 seasons. I think he's very important to this team, or they would not have extended him. I think dollars kind of talk sometimes. And, a lot of people love the quads on A.J. Dillon and all that, but that Aaron Jones is going to get the work. He's going to get the passing flow as well. So I'm in on Aaron Jones until the quote unquote the wheels fall off and something changes like drastically, like a coaching turnover or something like that. I'm with it, and I think that he's kind of fallen off the radar a little bit, just because other names are more popping right now, more popular in comparison to him because of the Packers situation. Mm-hmm. We'll end on a last note with a running back to close things out. Another guy, some say he's the most underrated running back in fantasy. Some say that, they're worried about his injury history and things like that, or, what he can do in this offense if they let his quarterback cook, even though the coach says they want to establish the run. But weeks 1 through 5, short sample size, but he started off the season well in 2020, RB5 across weeks 1 through 5. He's got a career yardage of 3,270 rushing yards, 4.6 yards per carry since entering the league in 2017. He seems kind of polarizing at times, though. People have either a strong opinion about, I draft this guy, he's a value, or I'll let him fall off my draft. But it's Chris Carson. My question to you is, do you think that Chris Carson is the most underrated running back for fantasy? And if not, if somebody else comes to mind, let us know.
Yeah, I'm going to say that he is underrated, very underrated. It seems like year in and year out, it's just like people just underestimate Chris Carson, and he's I would say consistently like a value, like in drafts, like each year, like really since 2018. Like he's tied to the Seahawks offense, which has been very productive. Like he's their starting and lead running back. Like he's averaged 19 opportunities, 92 total yards, and 15.5 PPR fantasy points since 2018. And if you look at this year, like he's projected for around 280 opportunities, and by opportunities, I didn't mention this earlier, but I mean like rushing attempts and targets combined. 1,200 total yards and like 10 touchdowns. It's tough to get a player that's getting that type of an opportunity share and that type of production in like the 3rd, 4th, maybe even 5th round. Chris Carson is that guy. Don't hesitate to draft him.
Yeah, and I think I'm not a big camp talk guy, but you see him working out at camp. He looks like a linebacker. He doesn't look like a running back. The guy's absolutely stacked, and he always is getting after it. Has he had some injuries before? Sure, but he hasn't actually missed like as many games as I think people kind of pin out for him to be or have missed. But I think the fact that DK Metcalf has emerged on this team and Tyler Lockett actually is a guy that has been doing well across the years actually helps Chris Carson. Not as many stacked boxes. I think seeing this past season how much Metcalf has grown, I think expands the field for this guy. So he's a guy I think I saw a tweet the other day. It was like, would you take Daryl Henderson or Chris Carson at an ADP of 21 or something like that? And it's wild that he has I think he has the ceiling to be a top 12 guy. I'm not going to say I'm going to rank him there, but if he finished as the RB 12 or like 13 or 14, I wouldn't be surprised. And you can get him at a great value if he's getting drafted as the RB 21 or 22. So I'm with you on that. So, again, Moody, appreciate your time. The whole point of the show, again, I feel like during this time of year, it's a weird time because we're like kind of getting into stuff. We're getting the camp news. We're getting rumors. And it's nice to just talk about some murky situations and some stuff we see in the fantasy community and just kind of like lay it out and say, hey, I wouldn't be worried about this. I would be worried about this. I think this guy could be the number one. I think this guy could be the number two. I mean, different situations. So I really appreciate your time. I think jumping back and forth was entertaining for me, at least. So as we close things out, Moody, can you let us know, of course, where to find you on any social media? And then if you want to plug something that you have coming up, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, absolutely. I can do that. But I would say, first of all, Nick, thanks for the invite. We'll have to do this again, very, very soon. So, hey, it's been a blast. But, as I mentioned earlier, as a senior fantasy analyst over at Pro Football Network, I create a lot of different types of content, written content, audio content, and video content all around fantasy football. But I can't stress enough, at PFN, we're the primary voice for pro football. A lot of content, not just fantasy football, latest NFL news, rumors, analysis on betting, NFL draft, college football, and more. But I would say one thing that I've been working on quite a bit this summer, which will end up launching a draft kit here in the near future. So a lot of different player profiles, that Tommy Garrett and I have been putting together, along with some other surprises with the draft kit. But I will plug at least some recent content that I've had, published. One is a 2021 IDP sleepers, where I go through a lot of different sleepers for those that play like IDP. I also had a piece recently that talked about rookies to target in redraft leagues that can provide immediate value. Also kind of touched on run heavy fantasy offenses, also with pass heavy fantasy offenses that you should target. And also, we kind of hinted on this earlier, but even with the fantasy strategy around should I take a QB early or late, where I kind of walk through the rationale on that particular strategy and what your fantasy team could look like if you implement it. I know we touched on stacks too. I had a piece where I talked about stacking in fantasy football and different stacks that you can prioritize in your redraft leagues. So I've got a lot of content, that's over at Pro Football Network that you can check out. But from a social media lens, you can find me everywhere, on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, even at Clubhouse. You can find me at Eric N. Moody. You'll be able to find me there. But hey, Nick, thanks again for the invite. Hey, it's been a pleasure. And until next time, my friend.
Absolutely, and super appreciative. Definitely check out Moody's work. He just laid it all out. If you're an IDP guy, just started playing IDP this past season, and I love it. Check it out. He's talking about schemes. He's talking about draft strategies, everything. So I love the fact that you are not just super singular on one topic and you expand into everything fantasy, because the fantasy world is bigger than most people actually realize. So again, if you're listening to this podcast and you're looking for something specific, I bet you Moody has written about it. So definitely check him out on Pro Football Network. Thank you guys for listening live, or if you listened on Apple, iTunes, or Spotify, or Anchor, or any of those things. Really appreciate that. Be at it next week on a live stream and different sorts of infographics, articles, and things throughout the week for me. So have a nice night, everybody, and appreciate the support.
Yeah.